The midday sun filtered through the tall glass windows of Levin and Clark, a high-end restaurant nestled in the heart of a well-heeled district in Washington, D.C. The space buzzed softly with the sounds of clinking glasses, low conversations, and a gentle hum of refined ambience. Waiters moved with precision across the polished marble floors, delivering meticulously plated meals to polished patrons in tailored suits and crisp blouses. Everything in the restaurant seemed to breathe wealth and exclusivity. At exactly 12:30, the front door opened to admit a tall man in his late 50s. His name was Richard Langston, a successful real estate executive known in certain circles for his bullish approach to business and his air of entitled confidence. Dressed in a dark blue suit, perfectly pressed, with cufflinks gleaming under the ambient light, he strode in with the kind of presence that expected the world to part for him. And in many places, it usually did. He didn't wait to be seated. He waved a hand dismissively at the hostess and pointed toward the corner table by the window. "I'll take that one," he said flatly, already walking in that direction. The hostess hesitated for a second. Protocol mattered here, but Richard's tone made it clear that his mind wasn't open for negotiation. She followed, giving a discreet nod to the server assigned to that section. The waiter, a tall black man in his 30s, approached with calm professionalism. His name tag read Marcus, and he'd worked at Levin and Clark long enough to know how to navigate fragile egos and passive-aggressive demands. Still, no amount of experience could fully prepare someone for the casual cruelty that sometimes emerged from wealthy clientele who believed their money could mask bad manners. "Afternoon, sir," Marcus said politely, offering the leather-bound menu. "Can I start you off with still or sparkling water?" Richard didn't look up. He was already pulling out his phone, tapping at the screen. After a pause, he gave a smirk and handed the menu back. "Still, and bring me the grilled salmon with the asparagus. No starch. And make it quick, will you, boy?" The last word sliced through the air with subtle but unmistakable sting. It wasn't screamed. It wasn't spat. But it was said with the ease of someone used to using it, someone who saw no harm in it, or worse, someone who didn't care. Marcus froze just for a heartbeat. His eyes met Richard's, and for that second, something unspoken passed between them. Not confrontation, not fear, just a silent recognition of the line that had just been crossed. "Of course," Marcus said quietly, retreating toward the kitchen. The word hung in the air like the lingering scent of smoke after a fire. A nearby couple, seated 2 tables away, exchanged a glance. A woman, in a tailored blazer, pursed her lips, her fork paused midway to her mouth. The soft murmur of the restaurant dimmed just slightly, as if the room itself was registering what had happened. But Richard noticed none of it. He had already opened a portfolio on his tablet, his eyes scanning charts and figures. In his world, Marcus had ceased to exist the moment he walked away. He didn't even register the murmurs. If anything, he assumed people were admiring his confidence, his efficiency. To Richard, words like boy were harmless throwbacks, the kind of teasing banter he imagined gave him charm. He never once paused to consider what it meant to speak that way to someone serving him, especially a black man. In his eyes, everything about the moment was normal. Marcus returned with the water, setting the bottle and a glass on the table with quiet precision. "Would you like a wine pairing today, sir?" he asked, voice steady but distant. Richard barely looked up. "Just a glass of your best Pinot Noir. And don't take all day." Again the tone, not aggressive, but dismissive, like Marcus wasn't a person, but mechanism, an extension of the table, an invisible arm to pour the wine, clear the plates, carry the orders. There was no animosity in Richard's voice, because animosity required a kind of engagement. What he had from Marcus was worse. Disregard. Complete detachment. Marcus walked back toward the sommelier station, careful to keep his pace composed. Inside, however, a familiar tightness had begun to form in his chest. Not anger, not even hurt, just a slow-burning weight of indignity. Another day. Another mask he had to wear to get through a job where grace was expected, no matter what was handed to him. As he prepared the wine glass, Marcus took a long breath, willing his hands to remain steady. He glanced over at Richard, who was now talking loudly on the phone. I told them to pull the offer if they don't budge by next week, Richard said, his voice rising. These people act like they have leverage, but they don't. I know how to break a deal and rebuild it in my favor. That's why they call me. He chuckled to himself, loud enough for the nearby tables to hear. It was more than arrogance. It was performance. Marcus approached once more with the wine, carefully pouring it into the glass. As he did, he felt the eyes of other diners shifting again. The comment from earlier was not forgotten. The atmosphere around Richard had grown colder, not from the air conditioning, but from the weight of silent judgment accumulating like snow. Richard took a sip, barely nodding. "That'll do," he said, waving Marcus away as if brushing off a breeze. And just like that, the opening scene had been set. A man so wrapped in his own importance that he couldn't see the temperature of the room had changed. A waiter forced to swallow disrespect to keep his dignity intact. And around them, an audience quietly watching, some uneasy, some angry, and one particular table that had yet to move or speak, yet somehow carried a presence that felt heavier than all the others combined. Richard hadn't noticed them yet, but he would, very soon. It was only after the second course had arrived that Richard finally looked up from his screen, long enough to notice the table adjacent to his. Seated there, partially obscured by a decorative plant and the curve of a sculpted partition wall, was a group of four, a man, a woman, and two younger individuals, likely in their late 20s or early 30s. They were immaculately dressed, not in a showy, branded way, but with that rare confidence that came from true refinement. Understated elegance, tailored silhouettes, quiet watches, calm demeanor. Their presence had weight. Richard's eyes narrowed slightly. Not because he recognized them, he didn't, but because of the way they carried themselves. Unlike the average diners who occasionally glanced his way with a familiar mix of envy and intimidation, this table wasn't reacting to him at all. There were no curious looks, no half smiles of admiration, no whispers trying to place his face. They simply existed in the space next to his, as though he were irrelevant. That fact, more than anything, unsettled him. He adjusted in his seat and resumed eating, but his focus wavered. Every so often, his gaze darted in their direction, trying to decipher their dynamic. They weren't speaking much, but when they did, their voices were low, the kind of intimate tone that made outsiders feel excluded by design. Occasionally, the younger man, sharp-jawed, composed, would lean toward the older gentleman, whispering something that prompted a nod or a brief smile. The woman at the table kept her gaze primarily on her plate, but every once in a while, she would glance toward Marcus with something that bordered on recognition. Not familiarity, more like awareness. There was something about the older man, especially his posture, the subtle lines on his face that revealed both age and experience. The way the staff seemed to move a bit more deliberately around him. Richard couldn't place him, but the presence was unmistakable. He wasn't just someone with money. He was someone who mattered. It was the kind of aura that couldn't be bought, only earned, and that made Richard instinctively wary. Unwilling to linger too long in quiet observation, Richard broke the silence between courses with another phone call. This time, the voice on the other end was familiar, someone from his firm's acquisitions team. He leaned back, speaking louder than necessary, launching into a monologue about an upcoming deal in Northern Virginia, rattling off figures and terms like a man auditioning for admiration. "They're desperate," he said at one point, his voice carrying across the room. "They don't know we already have zoning leverage. I'll let them sweat for another week before we close. Either way, it's a done deal. They don't even realize I've already positioned us to double valuation within 6 months." There was a calculated rhythm to his bragging. He wasn't just discussing business. He was asserting dominance, projecting power, filling the space with his voice like a dog marking territory. But the family beside him didn't flinch. They didn't even look his way. That stung. When Marcus returned to clear the appetizer plate, Richard gave a curt nod without looking up. But just as the waiter turned to leave, something happened that disrupted the flow of Richard's self-importance. A single voice, calm but direct, emerged from the adjacent table. "Excuse me," said the older man. Marcus paused, turning with professional instinct. "Yes, sir?" The man didn't raise his voice, yet everyone at the surrounding tables heard it. His tone carried weight not from volume, but from presence. "Would you mind bringing us a bottle of the Ridge Montebello? The 2012 vintage, if it's available." Marcus nodded immediately. "Absolutely, sir. I'll check with the cellar." The older man turned back toward his table, and the conversation resumed quietly, but the shift in atmosphere was sudden and undeniable. The moment he spoke, the energy in the restaurant changed. Diners who had previously ignored the family now turned subtly toward them, whispers beginning to circulate. Eyes widened. A few jaws tightened with realization. Richard, for the first time, felt the pressure of not knowing something he should. He leaned slightly forward, trying to catch a better glimpse of the man's face without being obvious. His phone still to his ear. He stopped mid-sentence as a realization crept into his expression. He had seen that face before, not at a party, not at a corporate event, but on television, in interviews, Senate hearings, press conferences. It hit him. That was Senator Elijah Rowan, a living pillar of American politics, a man whose decades-long career had been marked by integrity, poise, and a tireless advocacy for social equity. He was not merely a senator. He was a statesman, revered across political lines, respected by business elites and grassroots organizers alike, known especially for his unwavering stance on racial justice and systemic reform. The blood drained slightly from Richard's face. He turned his attention back to his plate, suddenly unsure what to do with his hands. The realization struck with a delayed impact. Every word he had said earlier, every arrogant boast, every dismissive gesture, and, most damning of all, the way he had spoken to Marcus, had unfolded in full view of someone who would dismantle him with a single public comment. The senator had heard it all, and yet he had remained silent. That silence now felt louder than any accusation. Richard shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware of how stiff his suit felt, how forced his gestures were. He had built his entire life on the assumption that his wealth and status rendered him untouchable. But in the presence of a man like Rowan, that illusion faltered. Because here was someone whose authority didn't come from intimidation or financial leverage, but from truth, from service, from character. And for the first time, Richard's performance felt embarrassingly hollow. Marcus returned moments later with the requested bottle. He approached the senator's table with reverent ease, presenting the wine with a quiet elegance that was clearly appreciated. "Thank you, Marcus," the senator said, his voice low, steady. The moment lingered. Richard, now silent, stared at his plate without eating. Something had shifted in the air, not just a recognition of power, but a confrontation with something deeper. An unspoken reckoning had begun, and Richard could feel it pressing against the edges of his composure. He wasn't sure what would come next, but for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel in control. Richard sat stiffly in his chair, barely managing to lift his fork without betraying the tremor in his hand. The warmth of his salmon had gone unnoticed, his appetite now overshadowed by the realization of who was sitting only a few feet away. Senator Elijah Rowan. It was a name that carried immense weight in political and cultural spheres, and one that Richard had heard many times but never imagined encountering so directly, and certainly not in the intimate setting of a restaurant where his careless arrogance had just played out like an unscripted confession. The senator had not acknowledged him directly, and that only made things worse. There was no confrontation, no outrage, no righteous scolding. Just an unwavering silence from a man who had witnessed everything and chosen, for now, to say nothing. The restraint was terrifying. It left Richard with only his own guilt and the echo of his earlier words. Now playing back in his mind with clarity, he couldn't escape. The word boy struck him again like a hammer, but this time it didn't land on Marcus. It landed squarely on Richard's own sense of self, shaking the foundations of what he believed to be harmless humor or social norm. He looked around the restaurant. The energy had changed. He could sense it in the sideways glances from nearby tables, in the hushed tones of conversations that paused whenever he shifted in his seat. What had once been his stage was now a courtroom, and the audience was no longer impressed. They were judging. He reached for his wine and drank half the glass in one swallow, as if that could wash away the discomfort clawing at him. He needed something, anything, to reset the power dynamic. to reclaim control. He turned his gaze toward Marcus, who was polishing glassware at the bar. There was something in the man's composure that made Richard uneasy. Not anger, not even coldness, just dignity, a quiet, unshakable calm. The kind of presence that didn't ask for validation, but commanded respect anyway. Richard hated that. It reminded him of the one thing his money could never buy, moral clarity. Just as he was about to retreat into another sip of wine, the senator stood. It was a slow, deliberate motion. He said something quietly to his family, who remained seated, and stepped away from the table. His movement was graceful, almost ceremonial, as if every gesture he made had already been thought through. He didn't look at Richard immediately. Instead, he walked directly toward Marcus. The room froze. "Marcus," he said warmly, extending his hand. The waiter turned, surprised but composed. He shook the senator's hand with a respectful nod. "Senator Rowan," he said with genuine respect. "You've been working here long?" the senator asked, his voice loud enough for the room to hear, but not so loud as to be performative. "Just over 4 years, sir." "Well, you carry yourself like someone who owns a place. That kind of pride in one's work is rare these days." Marcus gave a small smile, the corner of his mouth barely lifting. "Thank you. That means a lot, especially coming from you." The senator nodded once, then placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder, not as a gesture of sympathy, but of solidarity. It was brief, sincere, and it cut through the tension in the room like a blade through silk. There was no grandstanding, no speech, just respect. Then, at last, the senator turned toward Richard. The silence was absolute. Richard met his eyes and immediately regretted it. There was no fire in them, no fury. But there was something far worse. Clarity. The kind of gaze that saw through layers of artifice, an ego with surgical precision. It was not confrontational, but revelatory. And in that moment, Richard felt small in a way he never had before. The senator didn't move closer, nor did he lower his voice. He stood there, hands calmly at his sides, and spoke with a tone that resonated throughout the restaurant. "Sometimes," he said, "a man says something not because he means harm, but because he's never had to ask himself why he said it. That doesn't make it harmless. It just means no one ever held up a mirror." The words hung in the air. Richard opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. Not denial, not defense. Just the quiet weight of having been seen. Truly seen, for perhaps the first time in his adult life. The senator continued. "Privilege is a powerful thing. It lets you walk through the world unaware of how much space you take up, until one day you bump into someone who refuses to be invisible." He turned his head slightly toward Marcus again, then back to Richard. "You didn't bump into him today, Mr. He paused, waiting for Richard to fill the space. "Langston," Richard said, barely audible. "Mr. Langston, you didn't bump into him. You walked through him." The senator didn't wait for a reply. He offered a small nod, almost ceremonial in its finality, and walked back to his table. His family looked up at him, their expressions neutral, though the younger man offered a faint smile of approval. They resumed their quiet meal, untouched by the storm that had just passed through the room. Richard sat motionless, his breath shallow, his body rigid. For once, no words came to mind. Not for a defense, not for a rebuttal. There was no room for pride in the space left behind by those words. Just a slow descent of realization, heavy and irreversible. He looked at Marcus once more, this time truly seeing him. Not as a servant, not as an accessory to his lunch, but as a man. As someone who had borne the weight of Richard's ignorance with more grace than Richard had ever deserved. And it hurt, not because he had been called out, but because he had been seen, not just by others, but by himself. The restaurant, though returning gradually to its usual cadence of soft conversation and polite silverware clinks, still carried an unspoken weight in the air. No one had overtly turned their heads to stare, yet Richard could feel in his skin that subtle shift when the background of a room no longer flows around you, but centers on you. His body was present at the table, but his mind was splintering under the pressure of realization. He had always believed himself insulated by his wealth, his power, his social standing. But none of that armor could shield him now from the truth laid bare in front of witnesses who would not forget. His gaze remained fixed on the polished surface of his wine glass, now nearly empty. It mirrored his own state, drained, exposed, hollowed out. He gripped it without drinking, needing something tactile to keep him grounded. The conversation at the senator's table resumed at a gentle pace, deliberate and dignified, as though the moment with Richard had not been a confrontation, but merely a passing truth, delivered and then released. That detachment only deepened the wound. The fact that Senator Rowan didn't need to dwell on him, didn't feel compelled to argue or accuse, revealed just how little Richard's significance weighed in the grander moral scheme. But Richard wasn't the only one affected. Around him, murmurs began to spread. The diners closest to his table were trying and failing to appear unaffected. There were glances, quickly averted when met, and hushed comments passed across white linen tables. One man leaned in toward a companion and whispered something with a grimace. A woman near the window shook her head subtly, her eyes fixed not on Richard, but on Marcus, who continued his duties with meticulous grace. The judgment in the room was not loud, but it was omnipresent, a current running beneath the surface of civility. The manager of Levin and Clark, a slender man in his 40s wearing a discreet earpiece and an expensive smile, emerged from the back. He walked with purposeful discretion, approaching Marcus first. There was a brief exchange, words too quiet to be heard but rich in subtext. The manager's expression flickered between concern and embarrassment. He placed a hand gently on Marcus's shoulder and gave a respectful nod before stepping away. Then, to Richard's growing discomfort, the manager began making a subtle sweep of the dining room, pausing at each table that had witnessed the earlier moment. He was smoothing things over, offering the kind of quiet assurance that high-end restaurants specialize in, ensuring patrons felt valued, seen, respected. But not Richard. The manager never approached him. That omission landed like a blow. He was being bypassed, not just by staff, but by the space itself, as though he had become a liability the restaurant needed to distance itself from. Richard tried to recover some posture control. He straightened his back, adjusted his cufflinks, and glanced at his reflection in the dark window beside him. But the image that stared back no longer inspired confidence. His features, once sharp as certainty, now seemed dimmed by doubt. He looked like a man trying to remember how he had ever thought himself untouchable. The final blow came quietly. From a young couple seated 2 tables away, their voices low but not low enough. "I can't believe he said that out loud," the woman murmured, her brow furrowed with restrained anger. "I know, and right in front of Senator Rowan," her companion replied. "What a joke." Richard heard every word. He didn't turn. He didn't react. But the shame settled in his bones like cold water, the kind that seeps into you slowly until everything stiffens around it. This was not a scandal that would reach headlines. There would be no articles, no viral video, no dramatic confrontation. But it was, in some ways, worse, a social wound witnessed by people whose opinion mattered in circles Richard had once dominated. It was a kind of shame that wouldn't scream, but whisper in corridors and lounges and boardrooms. It would follow him not in outrage, but in the quiet exclusion of invitations never extended again. And then, as if to hammer the moment into permanence, Marcus returned to the table. He carried the check in a leather folder, placing it gently at Richard's side. There was no comment, no eye contact, only the calm execution of protocol. But when he turned to leave, Richard did something unexpected. His voice, strained and unfamiliar in its own tone, stopped Marcus in his tracks. "Wait." Marcus paused, slowly facing him. Richard hesitated, clearly unprepared for what he had just initiated. He looked up, his eyes meeting Marcus's directly for the first time since the insult that had poisoned the beginning of their interaction. He began, then faltered. There were no words ready, no rehearsed apologies, no easy exits. Marcus waited. Richard tried again. "I didn't mean," he stopped, realizing how hollow that sounded, even to himself. Marcus didn't move. He simply stood there, watching, allowing the silence to swell without offering rescue. Richard lowered his eyes. "I was out of line." There it was. Weak, inadequate, but honest. Marcus gave a small nod, not in forgiveness, not in acceptance, just an acknowledgement. Then he turned and walked away, his dignity intact, while Richard sat with the weight of his own insufficiency settling like dust around him. As he finally opened the leather folder, his hands moved slower than usual. The amount, though substantial, didn't matter. He added a tip, larger than usual, but it felt performative even as he did it. There was no salvaging the moment with money. What had been broken could not be repaired with gratuity. He stood to leave, and as he passed through the restaurant toward the door, he caught a final glimpse of Senator Rowan. The man didn't look up. He didn't need to. That, Richard understood now, was the most public embarrassment of all. Not the words spoken, but the silence that followed them. The heavy oak door closed behind Richard with muffled finality, sealing him off from the quiet storm he had left behind in the restaurant. Outside, the street was bathed in early afternoon light, the sun casting long shadows from the surrounding buildings onto the pavement. Cars moved steadily, pedestrians passed in quiet clusters, and the world, indifferent to his humiliation, moved on without pause. But Richard did not. He remained standing on the sidewalk, one hand still on the brass handle, as though unsure whether he was meant to walk away or turn back and try again. There was no clear direction anymore, only the residual echo of a lesson that had not yet finished teaching him. He took a breath. It felt uneven, shallow, as if the muscles he relied on for confidence and composure had forgotten how to operate. He stepped forward mechanically, his leather shoes making soft contact with the concrete. A part of him expected that the clarity of fresh air revived the version of himself he had always depended on, the Richard who negotiated seven-figure deals, who dominated boardrooms, who knew exactly who he was and why the world should listen. But that version remained distant now, unreachable behind the fog of the afternoon's events. He walked without purpose, letting the streets guide him rather than the other way around. His mind looped fragments of moments he couldn't erase. The senator's calm authority, Marcus's poised silence, the averted eyes of the other diners, the quiet disdain that had settled around his table like a sentence being passed. What disturbed him most wasn't that he had been judged. It was that, for the first time, he couldn't argue against the judgment. There was no misunderstood intent, no taken out of context offense. He had said what he said, acted how he acted, and had been seen clearly for it. Turning a corner, he found himself in a quieter part of the district, away from the mirrored facades and valet stations. The buildings here were older, less polished, their brickwork showing age. A modest park opened up ahead, a stretch of green bordered by benches and iron lampposts. He entered without thinking and found a bench beneath a tree, its leaves beginning to dry into the early signs of autumn. The wind shifted, lifting the hem of his tailored coat. But he didn't adjust it. He simply sat, hands on his knees, his eyes fixed on nothing in particular. For several minutes, he let silence fill the space where pride used to reside. It was not the silence of defeat, nor of self-pity. It was something else, an unfamiliar humility pressing itself into the corners of his thoughts. He remembered something the senator had said, something that had seemed rhetorical at the time but now landed with sharp precision. Sometimes a man says something not because he means harm, but because he's never had to ask himself why he said it. That sentence kept repeating itself in Richard's mind, more insistent with each loop. He began, tentatively, to turn that question inward. Why had he said it? Why had he used that word, in that tone, with that assumption? The answer, when it came, was not dramatic. It was small, quiet, because he could, because no one had ever stopped him, because the world he had built around himself had never demanded better. He let out a breath that felt different from the one he had taken when he stepped outside. This one carried something away with it, something old, something calcified, the beginnings of accountability, perhaps, or the slow crumble of an illusion. He thought about Marcus again, about the way the man had carried himself in the face of insult, without flinching, without resorting to anger. There was strength in that kind of restraint that Richard had never understood before. Not weakness, not servitude, strength. And he thought about the senator, not the man's power or status, but the choice he made, to speak not in condemnation, but in reflection, to offer a mirror, not a hammer. That was the part Richard hadn't expected. It would have been easier, in a way, to be yelled at, to be called out publicly. He could have pushed back against that, defended himself, blamed the reaction. But the quiet truth was harder to escape. It didn't attack. It revealed. He sat there for what felt like a long time, not watching the world pass, but allowing the shift within himself to continue. Slowly, he recognized that what he felt wasn't just guilt. It was grief. A kind of mourning for the man he thought he was. For the image he had curated over decades, only to realize it had been built on a foundation of invisible compromises and unchecked behavior. The confidence he once wore like armor now felt more like camouflage, designed to hide rather than protect. His phone vibrated in his pocket. He ignored it. For the first time in years, there was no urgency, no call he needed to take, no meeting he needed to dominate. Nothing would be fixed with a deal or a strategy. The problem wasn't external. It was within him, and it had been allowed to grow unchecked for far too long. He thought briefly about what might come next, how this moment would change him, not in some grand performative way, but in the subtle choices that formed a life, the words he used, the people he noticed, the assumptions he questioned. He didn't know if he could undo the version of himself that others had witnessed today, but he could begin to disassemble it from the inside. Eventually, he stood. There was no speech, no epiphany, just a man rising from a bench, aware now of things he could no longer ignore. He turned back toward the city. This time, when he walked, he felt the weight of his steps, not because they were heavier, but because they finally had meaning.